Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving deep into a powerful and cautionary story from the Old Testament, the story of Eli and his two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. It's a narrative about faith, responsibility, and the serious consequences of disrespecting what is sacred. Our story begins in Shiloh, the central place of worship for the Israelites at the time. The Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in all of Israel, resided there in the tabernacle. Presiding over it all was Eli, the high priest. Eli was a significant figure, a man who had dedicated his life to serving God and guiding the people. He was not just a priest. He was also a judge in Israel, a leader of the nation. For 40 years he held this position of immense trust and authority. Eli had two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, who were also priests serving alongside him. By birthright they were destined to follow in their father's footsteps. They worked in the very heart of Israel's spiritual life at the tabernacle in Shiloh. You would think that growing up in such a holy environment with a father like Eli would make them paragons of virtue, but sadly that was not the case. The scriptures describe Hophni and Phinehas in very stark terms. They are called scoundrels who had no regard for the Lord. This wasn't just a minor flaw. It was a fundamental corruption of their character and their priestly duties. They abused their power in shocking ways. Let's talk about what they were doing. When an Israelite would bring an animal to the tabernacle to offer a sacrifice to God, there were specific rules. Certain parts of the animal were to be burned on the altar as God's portion. Other parts were designated for the priests to eat. This was their provision, their rightful share for their service. But Hophni and Phinehas were not content with their share. They treated the Lord's offering with contempt. They would send their servant to the people making sacrifices, and while the meat was still boiling, the servant would plunge a three-pronged fork into the pot. Whatever the fork brought up, the priests would take for themselves. They were essentially stealing from the people and from the portion set aside for God. It got even worse. The law stated that the fat of the sacrifice had to be burned first, as it was considered the best part and belonged to the Lord. But Hophni and Phinehas were impatient and greedy. They would demand the raw meat from the worshippers before the fat was burned, so they could roast it for themselves. If the person objected, saying, "Let the fat be burned first, and then take whatever you want," the priest's servant would threaten them and take the meat by force. This was a grave sin. They were prioritizing their own appetites over God's commands and dishonoring the very sacrifices meant to atone for sin. Their corruption didn't stop at greed. They also engaged in immoral acts right at the entrance to the tabernacle, defiling the sacred space with their behavior. Their actions were a public scandal, a terrible stain on the priesthood. Their reputation spread throughout Israel, and people began to lose respect for the offerings made to the Lord. They were turning people away from God through their own wickedness. Now, what about their father Eli? He was an old man by this point, and he heard the reports of everything his sons were doing. He knew about their greed and their immorality. He confronted them, saying, "Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about your wicked deeds. No, my sons. The report I hear spreading among the Lord's people is not good. If one person sins against another, God may mediate for them. But if someone sins against the Lord, who will intercede for them?" Eli's words were true, but they were weak. They lacked the authority and the decisive action required of a father and the high priest. He rebuked them, but he didn't remove them from their priestly office. He didn't stop them. He allowed them to continue desecrating the tabernacle. By honoring his sons more than he honored God, Eli was failing in his most important duty. Because of this failure, a man of God came to Eli with a devastating prophecy. He reminded Eli of how God had chosen his family, the descendants of Aaron, to be priests forever. But now God was declaring a change. The prophecy was harsh. "Those who honor me I will honor, but those who despise me will be disdained." God foretold that Eli's family line would be cut off from the priesthood. His descendants would not live to old age, and his house would lose its position of honor. As a sign that this prophecy was true, God declared that both of Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, would die on the same day, and God would raise up a new, faithful priest who would do his will. This, of course, was a foreshadowing of the priest Samuel and later the priestly line of Zadok. Even after this dire warning, nothing changed. Then God spoke again, this time to a young boy named Samuel who was serving under Eli in the tabernacle. One night the Lord called to Samuel, thinking it was Eli. Samuel ran to him, but Eli said he hadn't called. This happened 3 times. Finally, the wise old priest realized it was the Lord calling the boy. He instructed Samuel to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And the Lord delivered a message to Samuel, a confirmation of the judgment against Eli's house. God told Samuel that he was about to do something in Israel that would make the ears of everyone who heard it tingle. He would carry out every threat he had made against Eli's family because Eli knew his sons were blaspheming God, yet he failed to restrain them. The next morning, Eli made Samuel tell him everything, and with a heavy heart, the young boy relayed the terrible message of judgment. Eli's response was one of sad resignation. He said, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." The tragic fulfillment of this prophecy came during a battle with the Philistines. The Israelites were losing, so in a desperate and superstitious move, they decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh to the battlefield, thinking its mere presence would guarantee victory. Hophni and Phinehas accompanied the Ark. When the Ark arrived, the Israelites shouted with joy, but the Philistines were terrified, yet they resolved to fight even harder. The battle was a disaster for Israel. 30,000 Israelite foot soldiers fell. And just as the prophecy had foretold, the ark of God was captured, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were killed. They died on the same day. Back in Shiloh, Eli, now 98 years old, blind and heavy with age, sat by the road, waiting anxiously for news. His heart trembled for the ark of God. A messenger ran from the battle line and entered the city, bringing the terrible news. When Eli heard that the ark of God had been captured, he fell backward off his chair by the gate, broke his neck, and died. He had judged Israel for 40 years, but his end was a tragic one, brought about by the sins of his sons and his own failure to restrain them. The tragedy compounded. Eli's daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant. When she heard the news that the ark was captured and that her father-in-law and husband were dead, she went into labor and gave birth to a son. As she was dying, she named the boy Ichabod, which means the glory has departed, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." This story is a sobering reminder of accountability. Hophni and Phinehas treated holy things as common, using their positions for selfish gain. Eli, though not wicked himself, failed in his duty to discipline his sons and uphold God's honor. The consequences were catastrophic, not just for their family, but for the entire nation. It teaches us that leadership, especially spiritual leadership, is a sacred trust, and it shows that God takes holiness seriously, demanding that those who represent Him do so with integrity, reverence, and obedience. Thank you so much for joining me for this powerful story today. If you found this video meaningful, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more content like this. We'd love to have you as part of our community. Until next time, take care.